Welcome to Drinking Through Theory, where I, a grad student, am going to whine about the larger power structures that exist in society. I'm hoping that through this video and my muddling through some theory that I will both enlighten you and probably enrage you a little bit, but at the very least, my synthesis will clear up a little confusion, maybe even make theory a little light and fun, or at the very least, maybe you'll become more politically active and use your damn voice in the political sphere, which controls, almost every aspect of our social and private lives. What theories am I grappling with? At large, neoliberalism. But specifically, this video will be a bit of a talk through of Melinda Cooper's recent book, 2017 book titled Family Values Between Neoliberalism and the New Social Conservatism. Essentially, Cooper's arguing that despite the proponents of neoliberalism and the new social conservatism, holding pretty different political views, both camps actually base their broader arguments on the topic of family values. And don't worry, because you're probably like, what are these big words? I will explain them a little bit later on in the video. Okay. So there's a few things we need to really nail down if we're going to understand this theory. The first is the concept of the Fordist family wage. So we're going to go back to the early 20th century. So strap on your aprons, lady, because we're about to get all domesticated up in here. The Ford family unit has been considered by economists and politicians alike as the ideal family unit in the United States. And what is it, you may ask, my dearest husband? Well, we have you, the breadwinner of the family, bringing home all the money, coming home from work to sit your lazy butt in front of the television while I do all of the domestic labor. Essentially, this structure reinforced sexual normativity. That is, that the male is the dominant one who economically takes care of the family, the wife and the children. The wife does all the domestic labor for free. And the ideals of marriage in terms of heterosexual monogamy were pretty much, the ideal. But as you can probably hopefully see a little bit, capitalism has its claws in this structure, right? So I personally view this Fordist family wage structure as, a microcosm of capitalist production. What that means is we have the capitalists, the few at the top who are in charge of all the labor of all the humans involved. So the capitalist, in my idea, is the male breadwinner, right, of this Fordist family structure, with the laborers, the women, doing all of the work, the housewives, and the children, with their chores and everything. So we more or less get that. So what we need to understand next before delving further into Cooper's theory is the welfare state. So Cooper actually begins her book by claiming that there is a noted American family crisis of fatherlessness. So this kind of idea that she's grappling with naturally goes against the Fordist family wage and therefore leads to single mothers, largely African Americans and Latinas, needing state support, right, to help raise their children. And our government don't like that. So this concept, right, of family values and the Fordist family wage is much more deeply ingrained in our society still in the 21st century than we probably conceive. Maybe we just put it in this history book and we're just like, oh yeah, the Ford family structure. This is still very prevalent. Okay. So Cooper goes on to explain the welfare state, right, and its associated programs. So essentially what the welfare state is it's a government redistributive program, right, for financial and health services. But it can also include public health and education and the arts. So it's kind of all wrapped in there. These programs have been continually reinvented throughout history to encourage adherence to the Fordist family wage and structure. Okay, so basically, all these social programs have been reinvented. I just said that. But with an emphasis on the man of the house, as the main source of economic security for women and children. And yeah, this is all really great, right? So what does this have to do with neoliberalism and social conservatism? I'm so glad you asked. Let us speed things up a little bit. Okay. We're out of the 1930s. Okay, we're gonna kind of fast forward. So During the 1960s and 70s, we had the cultural wars. Essentially, neoliberalism and the new social conservatism emerged in response to these uprisings, which included the civil rights movement, the welfare movement, the changing gender and racial workforce, as well as the increase in student radicalism. This was kind of all happening, and it was very like new left. And conservatives and neoliberals, and again, I'll explain in a moment, were like not cool with this at all. Neoliberalism became this new economic liberalism that favors the free market capitalism. Again, a lot of big words. So here's really the brunt of neoliberalism. Like, we're talking about placing all the responsibility of like social issues or personal issues on the individual, right? Like the state's like, I'm dipping out, okay? So simply put, individuals are free to make their own choices and therefore are responsible for themselves, economically, socially, like healthily. Neoliberals believe that cutbacks to government spending, social welfare programs, right, that it will restore familial obligations, okay? So at various points throughout this book, Cooper actually reveals how this like ideology links back to poor laws in England. And I'm talking like, we're going back to Elizabethan England, 1600s. And essentially what these laws were, they penalized and hunted down family members to take care of their sick. So if you were an adult child and your mother or father was aging and needed health care, and the state was like, we don't want to pay for this and stuff, they would hunt you down and make you take care of your family. Or if you were a single mother, you were first forced to work for free for the state. Now, although the U.S. federal government does not administer like physical penalties like they did during the Elizabethan era, like single mothers will be like getting hit with a whip, the penalties in our government are still pretty freaking drastic, and I'm gonna give you some examples after I drink some more wine. President Clinton, in particular, although many of his politics were built on his predecessors, right, and Cooper's book kind of does this whole historical analysis approach, so I don't mean to like not talk about Reagan and Nixon and all these other wonderful presidents. But anyway, so Clinton initiated this huge, one of the biggest welfare reforms since the New Deal. And the New Deal occurred during the 1930s. You can kind of like go read the book or do more research on that tangent. But what Clinton did do, and let me tell you, he essentially created a state-enforced paternity obligation, okay? So child support. Sure. Child support today is pretty pervasive. It's a widely accepted phenomenon, but this is kind of like what neoliberalism does. It infiltrates our society, and we see all these like social institutions and government mandates as good, right? They're good, they're ideal, we want these, and they're really just like new ways for the government to exert its power over the people. Well, let me kind of explain and break this down a little bit. Because neoliberalism argues for individuals to be responsible for themselves and their family, so private, individual, right? It's essentially like a scapegoat ideology for like the government to cut funding to social welfare. So Clinton's child support program, what it essentially did, and he didn't quite call it that yet, is mandate states to track down the biological father and force them to financially support the wife and child. Now, I'm not arguing this is a bad thing, okay? It takes two people to make a baby. Two people should be responsible for that baby. Totally, like, in agreement. But what this system does is it reinforces that a woman cannot survive economically without a man, right? She is economically dependent on a man, and the man thus provides the economic security for her. Cool. So Clinton's like Operation Find the Baby Daddy is just one example of like these types of reforms that have fallen back on, you guessed it, the Fortis family wage. Where are we getting at? Welfare, as you can see, has like transformed from originating as just a redistributive program for helping like those in needs to what Cooper calls, quote, an immense federal apparatus for policing the private responsibilities of the poor. Yikes. Oh, okay. I went on a bit of a tangent. we need to like go back a little bit and define new social conservatism. I think we're kind of getting neolib, right? Individual. You're responsible for yourself. New social conservatism. I think that most people would probably agree that they understand what conservative means, right? Like adherence to tradition, right? We want to conserve traditional values, especially traditional family values. Heterosexual, monogamous, marriage, etc. But this new social conservatism that again was emerging around the same time in response to these cultural wars against the new left. They were reacting against feeling like their power was being threatened. And when I say their, I'm talking about like the dominant hegemonic culture. And when I use those big words, what I'm saying is like white, middle class, heterosexual men who felt, you know, their family values and their ideologies were being threatened by an increasing like racially and gender diverse workforce, and people like wanting some fucking equality. Wanting some equality. Anyways, so they were like, give me back our power, right? They're like little toddlers, like throwing little hissy fits because they want their freaking power. So the task for neoconservatives was therefore to reinvent tradition. Cooper really kind of like hammers this down in her book that just because we've had all these really wonderful social movements doesn't mean that we're like completely changing the family structure. It's just being like reshaped and still somehow adhere to tradition. Neoconservatives at the time did not want to actually eliminate the welfare state, but rather they were trying to like reshape it to fit their conservative ideas. So they even called for the state to use force, such as police, if necessary, to like sustain their conservative family values. Okay, let's give a more like concrete example. So Cooper dedicates a fair portion of her book to the topic of AIDS and HIV. For many reasons, the increase of this disease gave rise to the government restricting access to healthcare for the LGBTQ community, right? So economists at the time, and again this is like starting around the 60s, believed that this market of sexual trade has risks, right? And because HIV, they argued, is usually transmitted through voluntary acts of unprotected sex or needle exchange, the results of their risky behavior should be dealt with privately, right? So like again, the government's like, we don't got your back. Let's just like we don't want to pay for this. What essentially happened is those who had this disease were like excluded from social services and social welfare. And by social welfare, I'm thinking of like Medicaid, Social Security, disability. Just the government wasn't down to help you because it was your fault, right? So again, we have this like idea of the individual chose to engage in these risky behaviors, and these behaviors went against this ideal for this family structure. So, you know, we can't help you. Okay, wait. Does this sound like neoliberalism? I thought I was like defining the new social conservatism. This is really at the heart of what Cooper's like theory kind of is arguing about. Essentially, during the time of these cultural wars, neoliberals and the new social conservatives actually joined forces in response to, you know, these new left ideas. So they both situated the family as the primary source of economic stability, not the state. And in the case of the AIDS epidemic, economists were actually pushing for same-sex marriage because, well, I hope you're kind of like picking up on this pattern, but if two people are married and one gets sick, who's going to be responsible for their economic stability and their healthcare bills? Oh, their spouse or the family. So again, it was a way to kind of make the state not responsible, right, for paying for your healthcare or providing those type of services. So in this sense, although like same-sex marriage goes against the conservative ideas of heterosexual monogamous marriages, this movement that economists were pushing for was like a reinforcement of family values or family responsibility. And essentially what it did was for neoconservatives, they were able to reshape these new left ideologies by fitting them to conservative family values. And for the neoliberals, they were able to push the responsibility back on the individual and off the state. So the individual and their family was, again, responsible for the economic well-being. I just want to clarify that this information does in no way does injustice to the fact that we should have marriage equality in our country. But I just wanted to distinguish, this is kind of what economists were saying at the time about these type of new left ideas. So, I've covered a lot in this video, but I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of Cooper's take on the role that family values play in the continual reshaping of our welfare state. If there's one thing, though, that I feel like you should take away, it's that economics is literally the backbone of U.S. politics. And obviously social welfare, of course. It's just like, Karl Marx was kind of really onto something when he argued that class tensions were, inextricably linked to capitalism. But what Melinda Cooper does in this force of a friggin' book is situate neoliberalism and the new social conservatism as two arms of the same body, right? They're interconnected. Sure, they're different, but at the end of the day, they're both paradoxically situated with the individual private family values as the basis of social policy. And on that note, I think I'm gonna need another glass of wine.